journalism. With a background in computational linguistics and interactive design, she creates experiments that analyze how the design of interfaces and algorithms affect online discourse and the spread of harm. Working with journalists and engineers at The Markup, a journalistic startup, I guess you could say. We'll learn more about that. And Angie helped build crowdsourced data sets for reporting, including the launch of Citizen Browser, a custom desktop application that collects Facebook data from panels of paid volunteers while protecting their privacy. She's collaborated on multiple data investigations covering Facebook's invasive behavioral targeting and the promotion of misinformation on the platform in the US and Germany. And most recently, her work has been cited in a class action lawsuit against Meta for unlawfully collecting personal medical data through its tracking pixel installed on hospital websites. Most interesting to us, maybe, beyond this very vital practice in journalism, Angie also publishes artist books that translate the themes of her research through experimental approaches. And these volumes are published under the imprint Unknown Unknowns and cover topics such as content moderation and underground economies in digital spaces. And this work is exhibited and distributed at art venues internationally. And I encourage you to look at her work at angiewaller.com and to follow her imprint on Instagram and Twitter, and we'll share those links later. And it is with tremendous pleasure that I introduce Angie Waller to give a short presentation to us here at Cloud Salon, and to discover more about this overlap in a new way of doing journalism with a data forensics approach and employing technology to be critical about technology and to hold companies accountable and to discover harmful practices that might be hidden behind the screen. And also how this kind of work can take a form of its own, whether that be through journalism or artist books and beyond. So it's with utmost pleasure that I welcome Angie to continue to take over the screen, and you can provide your virtual applause over the chat or through the various provided UXs. And we will open up the discussion later on after we hear more from Angie. So I will welcome you so much again, and take it away. You have a rapt audience that has formed for you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you. I'm really excited to be invited to be part of the series. As you know, as you just heard, I'm getting my Zoom techniques back into order. So my name is Angie Waller. These are two of my websites. I used to own many domains that I've cut down. So angiewaller.com is sort of a general overview of my work, and then unknownunknowns.org is where you can see some of the books that I publish. In addition to being an artist and having that practice, I also work, I'm currently at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU, where I work with researchers we do quantitative data analysis around social media. So a lot of the themes I'll talk about today, but those are all my URLs for now. So I wanted to start out by saying, like, usually when we talk about art, we think of beauty and things that, are aesthetically pleasing. And for some reason, I was always born being inspired by things that annoyed me. And so I would have to say that Jeff Bezos has been on my mind, or things made by Jeff Bezos have been on my mind for a long time. And as a side note, I think that it's very telling that my son, who was in third grade, chose to write an essay about Jeff Bezos while all his friends were writing about soccer and boba tea. So that's basically how much he pervades my life. And I would have to say that I've been doing work about Amazon.com since Jeff Bezos was wearing khaki trousers that were pleated and baggy shirts tucked in. So I want to give you a context of the time spectrum here. So when I first started studying Amazon.com, I was probably a student your age or like at your experience level. And Amazon looked like this. I've made it black and white. It wasn't black and white. I did that for to point out the thing in orange. But basically it was things were not so slick back then. And it was also, you would see books to buy. And then there was also this thing called CDs. So before Spotify, we were listening to music on physical compact disc that would be ordered through places like Amazon. Before Amazon, we used to go to record stores and borrow CDs from our friends. But Amazon introduced the first time that you could buy a book and then some sort of music was being recommended with it. So that might seem very boring now, or like we're very commonplace. But if you can just imagine that this being a new phenomenon, this was sort of a starting point for me in doing some research. So one time, I think around the time I was noticing the website, I was also learning web development, and I was buying like books about programming so that I could learn very cool technologies like Flash, Macromedia Flash. So shout out. And one time I got an email from Amazon saying I might like this CD by Stone Temple Pilots, which was not a band I liked whatsoever. And I thought it was really weird that they associated me liking a book about like learning programming, that I'm going to be into like this really kind of like jock rock stuff. So that started me like kind of investigating the site a little bit more. And I started going through books that I was like, what about like really extreme political books? Like what do those music recommendations? So things I started looking up were like Stalinism. I looked at Mein Kampf, and even those books had music recommendations tied to them. Stalinism was Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Erykah Badu, Led Zeppelin, and then Mein Kampf was like the Shrek soundtrack and things like this. So part of me was like, I got annoyed by something, and then I found some humor in it, and I ended up making it a little bit more of a formal investigation. And I made this book, Data Mining the Amazon, which is the first book that I ever made. And I basically decided to narrow down my research to looking at Republicans and liberals or Democrat, the books that were being shared in those groups and the music that was being recommended. And so I didn't know any programming. I didn't have any programming skills at that time. So I was just going through the website, making Excel sheets and tabulating like the music recommendations. And then I created these using Illustrator, these graphs that were like showing you what all the books that I found that were being recommended in those circles, and then the music recommendations. So this was around the time of George Bush, George W. Bush, and at that time, Republicans were being recommended the Beatles and Enya, and liberals were being recommended Bob Dylan and Oh Brother Where Art Thou. So this was sort of like a project I did where I honestly didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how much it would. I mean, now it's kind of funny that I was doing that, and now I'm working somewhere where we're looking at politics and social media. But I wanted to like share this really older piece I did, because it can kind of show you how things you're doing now might end up spurring something you're doing. Like it always comes, or it can't always come back. So things you're doing now can really resonate with what you're doing later on. Not only did the Amazon work sort of get me interested in like recommendation algorithms, but there's also another part of the book that was in the back where previously on Amazon, when the site was so clumsily designed, which maybe it still is, it's kind of their aesthetic, but you could also look at books and CDs that were being bought based on where people's IP addresses were located. So they used to publish, this was on their site. I mean, obviously I didn't do screen captures, but I collected all the data they shared of like the United Nations and Microsoft. I have pages about what the military was buying in different large organizations. And so you could see like the books that were very popular being bought and the music, which was just a very strange kind of eerie thing to me, that I could like get a sense of like what was happening. So this was sort of also And a lot of times when people ask me, why do you make these internet projects like books? Why do you choose that form? And part of it is like, I'm kind of making an archive of things that, like, this is no longer data that they make public on their site, but we know that they have access to this data. And so I think, and sometimes you don't realize that that's going to go away, but making these book archives is something that I can go back to and kind of see as like as a documentation or evidence of like something that exists. And so I continued making books after that one. Like I got really, obviously it took off for me to keep making books. And I tried to do things that are not only just like representing the information, but at times I try to also experiment with the form. So this is just a flip book I made of a GIF animation of a flip book. That's my, and then these are some books that I've published more recently under Unknown Unknowns. So I decided to kind of group things under that imprint. And I chose Unknown Unknowns because I think around the time I had the name was when Donald Rumsfeld was famous for saying that line, but I liked how it was going to be a way to inspire me to like try to do work about things I really didn't know what the outcome would be, and kind of take these more meandering paths of discovery. So I promise I don't only do work about Amazon, but I thought you would want to see this book was more recent that I did called Grifting the Amazon. And this was like similar to the weird email I got suggesting music. I honestly wasn't going out to investigate Amazon, but I was actually just trying to learn how to put a book onto the Kindle platform. Like, it's a very innocent skill I wanted. And I went to Skillshare.com, and there was a very handsome Dutch male model teaching how to do Kindle books. But it turned out he was actually doing this whole other thing that I wasn't expecting, and that was learning, like mass publishing lots of books that generated clicks and sales, and then just like using Amazon as like a passive income avenue. And so this is one of the pages from the book where there's a quote here from him where basically from his Skillshare, he's basically saying he's hiring people overseas that can work for a lot cheaper, paying them very small amounts to write books that are like 20 pages long. These are some of his books. They included like a lot of keywords in the titles so that they show up on search results. And so this whole video became about like how to exploit labor, how to game search engine optimization on Amazon, and how to make like this I think the word passive income is kind of a misnomer, because it's actually someone isn't doing labor, but you're passively benefiting from their labor. And so I started going through Amazon.com and like looking for more people that were doing this kind of work. I also interviewed ghostwriters that were being hired to do these books. And this is one of the funnier ones that I found. These were apparently two different authors that both write about dogs. They happen to have the same design on the covers. And then if you read their biographies, there's only like a few words that are different. So I started finding kind of these fake authors that are clearly probably people based in the US that are hiring overseas writers to kind of churn out these different books. And you can see at the bottom of the cover, there's like a zillion keywords to attract Amazon search. And this is like a spread of some more books I found that I think was all by one ghostwriter, or at least it's under one fake author. One of the ghostwriters I interviewed had written over 1,000 pet manuals in 1 year. So I was really astounded by the amount of content being churned out, and was trying to collect all the work that she was doing. And so more work has been done. I don't want to give away the ending of this book, but it goes into the underground economy I was talking about, where there's basically I think I came across, well, it came out in the press, and I think I come across it in my research, is some books that are used for money laundering. which is basically just like making books that are all about the exchange of money and not really about books anymore. And then, of course, as with everything on the internet, more recent work has discussed like hateful content being used in this way. But my book is kind of the precursor to that, and it's just fun pet manuals. So a few years ago, I got like a lot of the work I'm showing you, I did by like hand investigating, or like not doing any automated processes or programming to do the research, just sort of clicking through websites and discovering things. And I went back to school to learn more programming, and I did a computational linguistics program at the Graduate Center here in New York. And around the time I was doing that work, I started learning more about how machine learning algorithms are programmed, like how training data is set up, and kind of also just learning the limitations of automated, of machine learning and language comprehension. And around the time I was doing that work, some slides leaked from Facebook. Here's two examples, and they're a little bit, I tried to find ones that weren't, they're pretty all horrible. But they were content moderation training guides shown to temporary employees that were supposed to be reading through posts on Facebook and deciding if things need to be taken down. And what really surprised me was, I think hopefully everyone in this room is like familiar with the problems Facebook has with their hateful speech and how it's led, obviously our election might have been inspired by Facebook, but also just like how a lot of online abuse happens through these kinds of posts on Facebook. And what really amazed me at the time that these slides were leaked was that there wasn't really like a online manual for, or like any sort of comprehensive manual from Facebook. They kept their content moderation processes very low key. And when I went through these slides, I realized that they're so confusing. Like I couldn't even imagine how someone, especially someone overseas, trying to understand the cultural context of these slides would be able to really make any decision in the moment. And then on top of that, Facebook had been promising to do machine learning and have this all be automated, which also just really seemed really difficult based on all the complicated rules. So the slides weren't very informative to me, but I did go through them all. And I made that book, or here's the cover. And basically I took all the contents for the slides and sort of combined them in ways that made more sense as a whole, and also annotated like the very slight variations between two things that seem similarly violent, but one's allowed and one isn't, just to kind of show, basically I was trying to expose how lenient the moderation policies are, and how, and then also how difficult they are to like apply in a real-time context. And so I think probably these sorts of rules have come up more in the media, where there's basically, it's like these really strange combinations of rules where you can make threats, but as long as you don't say the place or a specific time, then you're allowed to make threats on Facebook, and just other things that were really strange to me. So the book is a really short, like 15 pages, but it combines all those slides into like what I think is more easily to read diagrams, but they're definitely more annotated and explained. So I don't know if any of you saw The Social Dilemma. It's a very, it's like a cheesy after school special was on Netflix, and it was really popular a few years ago. But I took this GIF animation that someone made from it because I really liked how, we talk about things that are data, and data is our algorithms are, making these decisions or controlling these recommendations we see. And I like this GIF because it's showing like human beings behind these decision-making algorithms. Even though it's not three guys in a room doing Minority Report, it's still a little bit more representing like a human side and agenda behind how these decisions and how data driven decisions get made. And so I want to just give like a brief overview of what A/B testing is, because the next few slides talk about it. A/B testing you've probably encountered, you might already be familiar with it. It's where you are presented with you're presented with something online, but maybe other people are presented with something different. And programmers look and see which thing gets the most clicks. And then the one that gets the most clicks becomes like the real scenario. So I'll go into a little bit more visual examples of that. But this is a more recent book I did called Outliers. It's intentionally misspelling the statistical concept of outlier because it was basically, again, being annoyed. This was done after the 2020 election, and leading up to January 6th, I was getting really frustrated with like tons of coverage of Trump and talking about how he's being dishonest, but it was like still repeating whatever falsehood had been said and like kind of hedging the language. So I used the New York Times API to collect headlines and do more quantitative analysis around what was happening. I think this is an example of, this is another example of A/B testing where different headlines are picked. The New York Times will, and other news publications like publish their stories, and they try out different headlines for some people will see one headline, some people will see another. There could be more than two tests. And then shortly after that release, they decide on one that will get chosen. So according to the headline editor at the New York Times, sometimes one version of a headline can get 1,000% more clicks. And here's an example that they shared was that using numbers often makes people click more often. So like this one talks about Trump getting $2 billion worth of free media. That one was more appealing to people to click on than just the more dry version, which was called Measuring Trump's Media Dominance. A sociology researcher, Angel Kirsten, did a book called Metrics at Work, which was a big source in this work I did, where she went into newsrooms and looked at how they look at metrics. And other things that they like to use in headlines is like using question marks and things like you might start noticing that headlines are often asking a question that's really annoying. And that's like another strategy for gaining clicks and for optimizing headlines to get more audiences. So the book also goes through some of just like the syntax of these headlines and kind of takes apart like how they hedge and like repeat misinformation. And probably all of you are familiar with the New York Post, which is very famous for their headlines. I think they're as they like, even if you don't like what they cover, their headlines are always sort of entertaining. It was really hard to find one for this slideshow that wasn't just an innuendo. So this one I thought was a little bit more safe for presenting. But they always do play on words. And this is an example of one in their website. And the reason I'm showing these is because I made a piece from data that I didn't collect, but Surya Matu, who was working at ProPublica at the time. ProPublica is a nonprofit news organization, hopefully you've heard of. They did a whole series where they looked behind, they called it Behind the Black Box, where they looked at how algorithms were targeting, how they collected data and how people were targeted. And one of the projects that Surya did with those journalists was looking at, he was able to build he's able to look into like the different network requests that websites make. And when these news organizations were doing A/B testing, he could see all of the headlines that were going to this testing third party and then pull those all together. So these two headlines were this was the winning headline, but the social media is killing your personal life was an alternative that they had tried for that. So the idea of the lenticular was like getting back into like a headline changing before your eyes, and sort of like a physical manifestation of the A/B test. This is another one that I liked. But what was funny about this whole process was like when Surya made a bot out of this data, but the data had also been part of the story with a news organization. And I think this was like the first time I realized like, oh, you can be doing these experimental projects, but you can also, it can, you know, there can be two parts to it. Like it's also serving like a public service need of kind of explaining things to a broader public. And so this turns out Surya ended up becoming a very major mentor to me and like helping me figure out how to like bridge this art practice into like a public service and journalism. And so I didn't know, I would have to say with the slideshow, it's a little challenging to merge like my creative practice with my work. I call it work. I don't know what you call it, everyone else calls it, but the things that I do that are more in service to other avenues outside of art. And so this was a project that we talked about in my introduction, that was called Citizen Browser. And so basically after all this time of trying to like dig behind the scenes and being like my own investigator going and looking at websites, this was an application that engineers at the Markup designed. And the Markup, in case you're not familiar with them, the markup.org, they're a nonprofit journalism organization, and all of their work is looking at issues around big tech. So a lot of the themes in my work, if you are interested, I'm sure you'd like their reporting as well. But we made this application, which basically got a representative panel of people to install and connect their Facebook data, and they would get a monthly stipend for sharing Facebook data. It's not as creepy as it is pretty creepy, but there was a lot of work that went into it to preserve people's privacy. So we're collecting like public posts, URLs and hashtags. We weren't collecting any of their personal friends' posts or information that could be sensitive. And through this work, we were able to collect data over a year. And these are some of the articles that we published from that data. Mostly what we were looking at was, you know, when Facebook would make a policy or promise a pledge like for protecting elections, and then we would find that that pledge hadn't been followed, we would be able to show evidence of that and write stories. Other things that we saw was like how invasive their behavioral targeting is, and how people could be targeted by race or especially medical condition. So those are different things that, in having a group of 1,000 people sharing Facebook data, we were able to uncover, and we wouldn't be able to without this tool. And this is just like a screenshot we used to share where to show that like we aren't collecting anyone's personal data. It's mostly the metadata that Facebook was using to share this information. And then I thought I would bring it to this. This is a project we did from the data that was like a live running archive of what we collected, which I thought kind of was parallel to the book I showed in the beginning where I was comparing Republicans and Democrats. This is where we were kind of showing how the people in our panel, like they would have to fill out a demographic survey. So we knew if they voted for Trump or Biden. We knew if their approximate age and, you know, just other characteristics. And we could look at the stuff that was being shown to them on Facebook and make a comparison. So as you might imagine, the people who voted for Trump on our panel were much more likely to see Daily Wire and Fox News post on their timeline, whereas people voting for Biden were seeing NPR and the New York Times. And then these are like, we had the top news stories that were shown to them. We also showed the top groups and the top hashtags that they were shown, which is often interesting. And then sometimes this was one time a matchup that, an accidental matchup that we didn't plan that around this, and I've already forgotten what the scandal was, but I imagine it was this actor was posting something offensive on social media, and the Biden voters were seeing like that she got fired, and the Daily Wire post was shown to Trump voters, showing how she's being censored, and kind of the cancel culture narrative. So that one was like a really easy apples to apples comparison. Then this is like a zoom in of the website, showing like different groups would come up that we like the Trump voters were being shown Flat Earth Friends, which was like a strange thing to see that was being promoted by Facebook. And I think that's basically, I just wanted, yeah, this is my awkward ending. I was going to this presentation this morning, I was like, okay, at the end. So I thought I would end on this graphic and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Angie. Wonderful introduction to your research and your way of working and the questions that you're asking. So I know it's awkward on Zoom, but typically if we were in a room together, there would probably be some applause for you right now. So some digital expression of gratitude and appreciation to the speaker would be appropriate at this time, as awkward as that might be. It might be reduced to some pixels being displayed, but the intention is there beneath that. So thank you. And I also would like to invite any of the attendees who'd like to ask questions, that they can pose some questions in the chat, and we can ask them on your behalf. If you'd like to ask your own question, you can use the raise hand feature. And as long as you're respectful, you could address the speaker directly with a question. We'd be happy for that too. But so as you may be thinking of questions and gathering, I of course have some questions for Angie that I hope especially the students in the design and technology program who are here might consider. So you did show these two kinds of practices that you refer to your art practice, which manifests in these artist books that then become a subject of exhibition and dissemination. And then you have what you call your work, which is, for example, doing a kind of data for forensics journalism for outfits like the Markup, which themselves are into digital accountability journalism, etc. But maybe to us, these practices seem very interconnected, and as you yourself reflected, that there's even ways that they can inform each other. So I think that's the first thing that's really wonderful to model for the students, that your work and your love work, they can be complementary and don't necessarily have to exclude the other, push one out the other. So I think that's just like a great thing, just to sort of, no matter what the topic is, this ability to continue to do art practice while also finding ways to apply it in the marketplace, for in this case, like producing news and so on. But I wanted to ask a more direct question though about how you see your methodology, meaning what you've described is you find things that like annoy you, and then you kind of gather observations about them, and that seems to be perhaps the easy part. But then you make this leap where then a concept is created around this observation. Can you talk a little bit about what is the methodology of like looking at data as a raw material, sort of evidence of something, and what's going through your mind to find a way to make an artifact on that? And you can answer it for either sort of modes of practice, because I would guess the answer is quite similar regardless.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, because it I know it'd be very helpful if I could give you a succinct answer to that. It really depends on, I mean, a lot of time I think of it as just like if I spend a lot of time making really bad choices in like how I might frame things, and there's a lot of trial and error and like what's going to work as stick as an idea and what's not. And I think that my background before doing this data work was working in video. I also was like working with found footage video, and I feel that that experience, thinking about making new narratives out of things I found like on the street, literally, probably helped inform how I do that with data. But I would say that in some of the work I was doing at the markup, you know, there are like just kind of you know, there was an article I published that was around the German elections, and like seeing that the far right party there was like really showing up a lot on their feed. And part of that was just like, you know, I had done like a class on Google Analytics, and like just kind of using like kind of basic, you start to learn like basic tools, like how do I surface like the things that are showing up the most often, and how do I surface you know, on the citizen browser data, like I could see like what posts are getting the most hates, like where does that lead me to find. And so sometimes I think it's like you start dipping in and like finding ways to filter things and kind of take all this massive information and make little packets, and through there you start to see or something that resonates. But I think also one of the stories I worked on as well was like, you know, I went to an art exhibition, and it was one of those things where like not being in the data, but like seeing how, I think a lot of times when we're working online, we get really consumed with data, and we forget the world context of things, like how, you know, especially like with Facebook, like if they're targeting people based on medical conditions, like if you go out in the world and kind of see how people might like see how those communities that maybe have disability are treated, and kind of understand the creepiness of that, and those things can resonate. I think if you spend too much time looking at data and the computer, you kind of lose a lot of, I think what's a lot of the problem with tech, how tech companies maybe manage their systems, is they're not really connecting with what's outside of them. And so I think if any of you are studying data analysis or data science, I would always recommend like not spending any more time than you have to in the data, and really like understanding how it connects to the real world.
Yes. And yeah, to that, I wanted to maybe ask about some of the projects that you've done for the markup, maybe the one where you are using the citizen browser toolkit to then yield other projects, maybe like the opposing timeline project, and connect that maybe to the project on grifting Amazon, trying to disentangle like what is evidence of people's conscious preferences and what is evidence of people's unconscious preferences, and what is evidence of people's behavior being nearly dictated or induced or incentivized by either the algorithm or the platform. So for example, when you described how by making it easy to publish and sell books, it creates the incentive to make fake books to then game the system for various things. And so there we see an example of the platform kind of can induce fraud because it wants that to happen. Actually, there's nothing that is saying don't do this. So when we look at the projects around the political issues, what observations are you seeing, or how, when you're working with colleagues at the markup, how are you trying to untangle what the data might mean, and what if it's meaning multiple things at once? How do you break this down for the general readership?
I think after my critique of Times headlines, I think there's a lot of hedging. Like I don't think anytime we presented a finding, we never talk about it being like the intention, like Facebook's intention. It's just kind of the result of whatever some other decision that was made. You know, I don't think it's Amazon's intention that these insane, you know, pet manuals are being written, and you know, but it's sort of like their, as you were saying, their system sort of becomes like a home where that's possible. And And I think as far as like the content people consume, like they're, you know, I I think in the piece we wrote up around the split screen, you know, the word filter bubble, you're probably all familiar with, that is commonly used to say that people are not exposed to other information, and that's why they have these beliefs. But I do think that people also, you know, choose, like, people are part of that system as well, and so I don't think it is would be disingenuous to just blame it on, like, we're all just being influenced by an algorithm. Like, I think that, but what happens is things get amplified through algorithms. So if you have certain beliefs, you can amplify your beliefs through the way these systems are set up. For instance, you know, like with the work I did on the German elections with Citizen Browser, the far right party that was very commonly shown in people's timelines, like, they were also posting things about this, you know, COVID restrictions and getting a lot of those hate reactions. And then it turns out Facebook's algorithm gave those higher scores, and so they were getting higher up. So, you know, I think this, we're all kind of like a ecosystem, and it all works together. I've done other work where I look at how people's behavior isn't, you know, my thesis for computational linguistics was looking at the website Rate My Professors, and looking at how when they changed the website to remove the chili pepper, if that changed how people wrote reviews. And so I think like nothing was making someone do something, but there are like little influences that happen through the design. And a lot of times that those influences can kind of become magnified and harmful.
And just a follow-up question on some of the discoveries that you've been able to make with the data collection mechanic, and then the resulting data, and then the ability to analyze it. Where do you see some of the limitations to what you're able to collect with this voluntary system as you're trying to, you know, do really difficult things like explain how the Facebook newsfeed algorithm works? And to be even more specific, like disentangling, is there any way that your methods and data can show the difference between Facebook's algorithm serving content because it has predicted that the user is most likely to engage with it, versus that person's conscious choice to select and reinforce those selections? Getting back to the other question, like, is there any evidence that you're seeing in the work that Facebook even knows the difference between somebody who was nudged versus selected?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think Facebook only has a limited view of what we like, and they make a lot of assumptions based on, they have like a lot of noise in their decision-making data, and a lot of that's based on really pervasive surveillance around what we do online. But I think any of you can, I don't have it handy, but I think somewhere I could send it later, but you can always go look at like how they've tagged your interest online, and often you'll find that a lot of them don't match what you would ever associate with yourself. And I don't think that they know you better than you. I think it'd be nice if they let us select our interests rather than trying to predict them. So I would say, as far as like when you're doing crowdsourced data, you don't know if people are like, I mean, we did have ways to know if people are members of groups or if their friends were members of a group, and that might be why they saw certain things. But I think when we started seeing consistent recommendations around groups of people, that started to be something where it did look like it wasn't necessarily an individual's choice. Like, chances of them having so many similarities with someone across the US might be not so likely. But definitely there are a lot of limitations where you don't know, how people are encountering information. And I think a discipline that's really helped me think about it is in discourse analysis. There's work around like how to survey people that are and taking in content online, and it's like what you hear out the window, what's if your kid's in the background on the floor, if your kid comes and uses your computer, if you what kind of device you're on, all these things kind of influence what the the receiver gets. And so I think reading that work has kind of helped me to learn how to write about things so that you're not making bold assumptions about what you're seeing, and you can kind of contextualize like very specifically what you have and what you don't have. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of the best way I can describe.
Thank you. Yeah, that is very helpful. And this is, it's we have imperfect tools and imperfect methods and imperfect support mechanisms to penetrate, basically like a blue tower of trade secrets. So, and we learned that the companies don't necessarily comprehend, understand, document their own work. We've recently seen in a related Facebook lawsuit that that developers at Facebook don't write documentation for their code as a kind of like cultural practice within the company. Or we're hearing from whistleblowers that Twitter doesn't have a production and a development environment. It just does the production and just makes changes live, and the entire company has access to the whole machine and all of its data. So we're like starting to like maybe gain a better appreciation that these companies are not as well run as they have projected that they are, and that we're poking away at the way that these companies are spaghetti and held together with the duct tape and glue, just like most technology. That their sort of mastery and power is not necessarily reflected behind the hood or when you lift the hood. So wanted to ask a question before we get to some of the audience questions. Speaking of our audience, when you do art, you're most likely doing it for yourself, but you are selling your books. So as you've engaged with that, who is your artistic practice audience? Who are the people that appreciate and have gratitude for the artwork that you're doing in this area? And how has disseminating work in that realm brought you closer to that audience?
Yeah, I would say that I have a pretty wide ranging audience. And when I present, like for instance, I'll be at the Printed Matter Book Fair in October. And so I would say that's like a way that I really, unlike analytics, like I have a face-to-face relationship with a lot of my audience. And so I'd have to say like a lot of my people who enjoy my work are designers and artists that, appreciate like the dissemination of how I get the information on a page. But I also really enjoy like people who work at these tech companies that sometimes they might be not excited about some of the things they have to do, or they might be concerned about critiques they hear out in the world, and they really enjoy that I'm making this work and support it because it kind of is like an emotional support if they're working in these large tech companies and have questions. So I think there's like a wide array. But even, and I think it is a little bit, my beginning when I was showing you the Amazon book, the first one, when, the old Jeff Bezos one, that was when I was really just solely around artists. I didn't know any tech people at all. And that was a really hard audience to sell to. Like my first advisor, he was not ever on the internet. Like he didn't touch the internet. He was against the internet. And having to just explain to him what Amazon.com was and the whole thing was really challenging. But I felt that, I don't know if that was always the best decision to work with that group, but I think what I did learn from it is that if you can find kind of a conceptual underpinning that's not relying on the tech, it's about something that's a little bit more wider and universal, that you can appeal to these audiences that aren't working in tech companies. And people can relate to music or politics, and And so if you can find those universal themes, you can talk to wider audiences than just data people.
Nice. Yes, that is a great perspective on the question, and it is really it's surprising and wonderful to hear that the target audience, is the people being criticized, and that they're seeking that critique in outlets for that in unexpected places. And it also gives kind of life to the role of a social practice, or a critical art practice, that it doesn't have to exist in itself, that it can have an influential effect, potentially more influential than a kind of direct intervention, or some kind of market intervention, or some kind of, more sort of simplistic way of creating an intervention. So I think that's a really interesting and surprising response. I mean, I think for the design and technology students, I hope that that you take away the mindset of the journalist in, finding stories, finding evidence, doing the like research work of the journalist, and then when building tools to do the journalistic work, whatever needs to be built to find the answer, there are a lot of similar expectations in the program to do similar things. And I often find that students in the program forget to just look at the practice of journalism as a model for what they need to do. They have to find scoops and be on a beat and hold power to account and potentially build tools to do that. So a wonderful kind of practice, and you're like working with others like at ProPublica, and the team that formed the markup out of that, led by Julia Ongwin, who have been defining this new way of a sort of tech-enabled journalism. So it's very exciting for our community. So the last question is I'm trying to synthesize the two questions that are in the chat, because I think they're kind of asking the similar thing. With the first question was about, how our own biases play into our the way we do the work. And the second question, I think, missed, they came in late perhaps, but missed, the different ways that you collect data, both manually and through, for example, the citizen browser, very like sort of more scientific methodology. So I guess the question is, when you are planning a project, working on a project like Citizen Browser, how does the question of personal bias influence the planning of that, and like how to make ethical choices when you're doing a kind of project like this, where you're like acknowledging your own bias, but also trying to perform the research with a set of values?
Yeah, I think I would say that before building Citizen Browser, we're more, our main focus was just privacy. There's so much personal things that are in these platforms that you really don't need in your research. And so I think that is more the key in the planning part. And then I think as far as like writing and reporting or making books with that have my own biases in them, which they definitely will, and it's sort of unavoidable. I think what's most important in trying to mitigate that is either to, or what's helped me a lot in doing and mitigating that is being able to present my work face to face to people, and especially in book fairs. And because it's not an arena like this where someone might be uncomfortable calling you out on something they don't understand, but being able to kind of have one-on-one conversations with audiences, and kind of understanding, when my own preconceived notion of something might be infecting my work. But I think that just takes experience and being aware of other people's work, and constantly, just doing that research and trying to learn, where you can be less limited. And then I see the one about my data collection methods. So a lot of work I do is just looking in the developer tools and looking at stuff that's being sent to places, and just kind of looking a little bit behind the scenes of websites. But then I've also, since having my most recent degree with computational linguistics, I'm doing more things with web scraping. Or as the Citizen browser, I was working with engineers where we made a tool that actually was doing web scraping. So there's some very low tech ways I do my research and collect data, and then there's more high tech, and yeah, I do. If sometimes there's public data sets as well that I work from, and then I see that the NLP and its potential effects to our society. That's going to be a question that I'm working on that's kind of fueling my art practice, is thinking about how algorithms around language and how we express ourselves are changing how we interact with each other. So I think that there are effects. I don't know if they're all good or all bad, but definitely that's just sort of but I agree that's a very good question, and that's going to probably fuel my work for a while until I get tired of it, I guess. I don't know. But at least I can imagine at least 10 more years I'm going to work on that.
And I would expect synthetic media to be the most significant development in the near term. It's the immediate frontier of it's what's moving really quickly right now, and people in DT need to pay attention. It's not VR, it's synthetic media, folks. Well, we are out of time, so let us give a wonderful applause finally to Angie. Angie, thanks so much for presenting to us and sharing your work. Follow her on Twitter and buy her books, and stay tuned for the next work. Thank you so much,
Yeah, and
Angie.
feel free to email me or tweet, if you follow me, feel free to message me if you have any more questions. I'm happy to hear from people.
Thank you all for joining us today at Cloud Salon, and have a great rest of the afternoon.